World War II is seen today, understanding the legacy of the conflict 75 years later. Good afternoon and welcome to Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs and this webinar series brought to you by the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. This event is co-sponsored by the European and Eurasian Studies Program, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program, the Department of History, Department of Politics and International Relations, the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, and the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab. I'm David Kramer, Senior Fellow at the Green School at FIU, and I'll serve as today's moderator. 75 years ago, the deadliest war in history came to an end. As many as 80 million people, civilian and military, lost their lives, including 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. Last week marked the 75th anniversary when atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ushering in the nuclear age. The devastation was global, and in the war's aftermath, the world emerged a changed place. The United States became the leading power, but soon engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union for the next 4+ decades. China joined the communist ranks in 1949, while Germany and Japan eventually emerged as thriving democratic societies. New institutions came about, such as the United Nations, the European Union, and NATO. World War II also influenced art, culture, and society in numerous and significant ways. Those who lived through, survived, or fought in the war are dwindling in numbers every day. But our debt of gratitude to the greatest generation, as our veterans from that time have been called, including my late father, will never die. 75 years later, let's reflect on the legacy of this epic period. Joining us to discuss this legacy are 4 terrific panelists here at FIU. First is Professor Thomas Breslin in the Politics and International Relations Department at FIU, Rebecca Friedman, Associate Professor in the History Department, as well as Director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab, Terrence Peterson, Assistant Professor in the Department of History, and last but not least, Oren Steer, Professor of Religious Studies and Director of FIU's Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program. So Oren, if I can, I think we'll start with you. I'll ask each of our panelists to offer a few opening reflections and thoughts, and then we'll turn to a discussion, and then also look for our audience members to send in questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So Oren, over to you, please.
Terrific, thanks David, and thanks to my colleagues as well for joining us for this conversation, and for FIU's Graham Center team for running it so expertly. I want to start my remarks just with a caveat that, as many of you might imagine, my perspective on the war is in many ways filtered through the lens of the Holocaust. And while that's not my exclusive focus, it does define the way I view things. And one way that comes out very directly, as David already alluded, is the issue of numbers. The flyer for this webinar and David's introduction cited civilian and military casualties as high as 80 million. That's not a number that I work with as often as the 6 million number, which David also mentioned, which represents the estimated number of Jews murdered during the Holocaust. But then there are also others deemed by Nazi policy to be racially or biologically inferior: Roma, Germans with disabilities, some in the Slavic peoples, communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals. The number beyond the 6 million is a very difficult one to count. We might get into that discussion later. I don't really want to get into the issue of numbers now, but just to really say that everyone's perspective on the war 75 years later is going to come through a particular filter and a particular angle, and in many ways this is probably mine. I want to highlight 3 key legacies that I see of the war in terms of what things looked like at the war's end, and how they do or do not persist into the present day. And the first and most salient for me is the issue of mass death. If World War I really ushered in an age of expendable soldiers, the phenomenon of trench warfare and the kind of the way that soldiers were used in ways never before seen. I think World War II extended that very much to define an idea of war including expendable people, whether military or not. And obviously, that aspect of mass death, for me, in the context of the Holocaust especially, is really very profound. It wasn't just mass death. It was a certain kind of death. It was mass murder, mass political violence, genocide, which is a term that didn't exist at the start of the war and was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944 in the course of his documentation of Nazi policies of systematically destroying national and ethnic groups, including the mass murder of European Jews. And then that was enshrined in the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And so very much at the start of the 75-year period, we have this issue of genocide as never before being defined in this way, even though Lemkin himself defined it as something old and new, with new characteristics. And I think in many ways we are still living in the age of genocide. We all can look around and see that genocide is sadly not ended. And this 75-year period has been marked by it. In terms of mass death, we also can't overlook the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that led to the end of the war, but were also innovations in mass killing. And their specter also still looms large today. We're not yet in the post-atomic age. So 75 years later, we're still dealing with issues that arose from that time. The second legacy I want to highlight is the refugee issue and the refugee problem. I think there's a sense when we talk about this year of the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II as some sort of a triumph, and in many ways it was, but we often overlook the mass refugee problem at the end of World War II. That doesn't really get talked about or recognized in the midst of that sense of triumph and relief at the end of the conflict. And numbers range widely, but anywhere between 11 and 20 million displaced persons in Europe alone, from what I could find out. And we think, wow, that's just a phenomenal number, but that number is dwarfed by the UN estimate of 79.5 million forcibly displaced people worldwide at the end of 2019. So again, 75 years later, I don't think we're any much better of a situation. And that really leads me to my final point, my final legacy of the war that I would love to hear from my colleagues about is, I think it in many ways, it marked the failure of modernity, the failure of political, societal, and especially technological progress to bring about real and lasting improvements in the human condition. So 75 years after the end of World War II, I wonder how much we have really grown as a human race and what we have to show for it. So I will pass the baton.
Oren, thanks so much. I appreciate that for kicking us off. Terry, let me turn to you next, if I could, please.
Great. Thank you, Oren, for getting us off to a good start. I want to sort of follow up by building on some of Oren's points. I think, you know, as Oren's rightly pointed out, it's hard to sort of underestimate the impact of World War II as an event itself, right? This wasn't a war as World War I or some of the other large conflicts of the early 20th century to defeat the enemy. It was a war to erase the enemy, right? And you can see that reflected in not just the behavior of the Nazi regime on the Eastern Front, but the ways that other belligerents like the Japanese government and the American government prosecuted the war in the Pacific. And it, you know, the sort of sheer scale of the war really makes it hard to avoid having profound legacies. The sort of big, you know, sort of second point that we can touch on here is that World War II is not just a discrete event in and of itself. It's also the starting point, sort of the birth point of the world that comes after it, right? You can't have 70 million dead. You can't have 50 million refugees without having to rebuild society from scratch, right? There's this famous film, Germany Year Zero, that takes its name from this sort of widespread concept that Germany really had to start rebuilding itself from scratch after the war. And it's really not just Germany, right? The geopolitical system of empires that the Nazi project to colonize Eastern Europe in many ways sort of takes to the most logical extreme, that starts to fall apart after World War II, precisely because it's been discredited, right? 50 million refugees need to be resettled somewhere, and not always in the places where they were before, right? You have, we sort of think of World War II as being the triumph of this sort of nationalist moment of nations against one another, but actually it's the beginning of the nationalist moment, because the Nazi project to remake the demography of Europe really succeeds in really profound ways. When refugees return home, they often return to a home that they've never been to before. So World War II is really an event that is deeply destructive in its own right, but sets the terms for the world that's going to come after that, whether it's the demographic terms, whether it's the very basic concepts of international law, whether it's the legitimacy of empires or something different, right? Or a new form of empire. Many people have argued with the Soviet Union and the United States. So it's really an event that, you know, we seem to talk about all of the time, every single year, not just on the 75th anniversary of its end, because we really can't avoid it. It's the foundational moment for our era. And the third thing I want to sort of touch on, besides the war as a discrete event and the war as a starting point, is that very element there itself, right? Part of the reason why we talk about World War II so much is that because as the sort of founding moment of our second half of the 20th century, it's this site of really profound memory and identity making, right? And I sort of joke with my students. I teach a class on World War II, and we talk a lot about memory, and I assign them a different sort of op-ed on why World War II is important today every single semester that I teach it, because there's a new op-ed on why World War II is important today every single semester I teach it, right? It's the sort of touchstone in culture that we come back to repeatedly, because the way we talk about World War II really says something about how we understand ourselves, how we understand our identity, how we understand the world around us, right? We can just look to the invectives that people throw around in everyday politics, right? The worst thing you can call somebody is a fascist. That makes it hard for people like Oren and I who work on fascism and want to define that term in really clear ways, right? But it also speaks to sort of the profound grasp that World War II has on our imaginations, because it's so deeply rooted in our international legal structures, in the way that we understand the world and what it should be, in the way that we understand the very nature of human rights, right? Just like genocide, an idea that really didn't emerge in the way that we understand it now until the aftermath of the Second World War. So it's a war that's profoundly important on its own right. It's profoundly important because it transformed the world for decades to come, and because it's this touchstone that we continue to return to all of the time, not just here, but in sort of every country that was massively impacted by it, to define our own selves and talk about our world today.
Terry, thank you very much. And so now let me turn to Rebecca, who I think is going to focus a little more on the Soviet Union and the legacy there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, David. Thank you, Oren. And thank you, Terry, for your excellent comments. I actually want to scrap everything I was going to say and talk about modernity, but I won't. I'm hoping we can come back to it at the end, because I think that's a fascinating question you posited there, Oren. But I'm going to talk about the Soviet Union and Russia. So it's difficult to think about how to discuss the impact of World War II commemoration within the Russian context 75 years after Liberation or Victory Day. It is simply everywhere, built into the very fabric of the everyday. So I decided to start with a few stories from personal experiences, and then to just suggest some overall themes, hoping we can circle back to in the discussion. As the comparison, given all of the expertise here on the panel, is pretty cool. So I first went to Moscow in 1988, it dates me. In those days, under Gorbachev's watch, it was hard not to be aware of the Soviet Union's role in the Great Patriotic War. I recall myself, a junior in college, waiting in line in the cinema, Glasnost era film, for those who know, Little Vera, side note, classic Glasnost film, replete with explicit alcoholism, domestic abuse, and sex. The theater itself was still really cheap back then, but much coveted. And when it was almost my turn to buy the tickets at the window, a much older gentleman, decorated with a full chest of medals, gently stepped ahead of me in line and bought his tickets. The ticket taker saw his jacket full of decorations, including primarily World War II ones, and said, "Thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for everything." It is a moment that's difficult to forget, as is the evening of May 6th, 2019, when I was last in Moscow, long before Corona was a household word. On that cool Moscow evening, strolling arm in arm with my wonderful graduate school era friend Amy, we watched the second of 3 rehearsals for the big show to come on May the 9th, Victory Day. It was not easy to actually find a spot to watch the Victory Day parade rehearsal, as the city shuts down each day for the Maisky or May holidays. Barricades, militia, crowds, this time weaponry on the various police officers, just in case. Let's just say you want to avoid being in a car in the Moscow city center during these holidays, including the Victory Day parade and its 3 rehearsals. After about 2 hours of walking around, failing to find a spot where 2 kind of shortish women could see, there was no way to get close to the Kremlin, we found ourselves a place. We stood in a crowd of Muscovites waiting for the parade of tanks that at any moment would roll down Tverskaya Boulevard, the central boulevard, during the second of these 3 rehearsals for the show. And roll they did, with full weaponry atop, and the smell too was unforgettable, as though war were happening right in front of us, as they sped by, crowd cheering in awe. One small girl atop her father's shoulders saw the tanks and shouted as loud as she could, "Papa, Papa, what beautiful tanks, look, wow." And so this young child in Moscow in May 2019 understood the role of her people in the war, mighty and victorious and proud. Such commemorations and military showmanship is spectacular and does, in no uncertain terms, reflect the ways in which the war and the Soviet victory and liberation and loss and sacrifice defines contemporary Russian consciousness, from the personal to the political, from the individual to the collective. The numbers, the loss to each family, the pride in overthrowing is everywhere. You can't miss it. In fact, even Stalin himself has been somewhat resurrected in the Russian imaginary. Not the leader who orchestrated the purges and the brutality of the 1930s, but the leader who was responsible for building such an industrialized military and inspiring a citizenry that would overthrow the fascists at any cost. One could argue the end of the war is the source, until this day, of national pride. A few words now, since I don't have much time, on the layering of history, and then briefly to turn to today in 2020. So the layering of history. Moscow 2019, May, also means decorations all over town, and not just in Moscow, I'm told. On each street corner, one found flags, symbols painted everywhere, or posted everywhere. The Soviet flag, hammer and sickle, next to the Russian one. There were also young people selling the classic Soviet army hats on corners, encouraging the citizenry to join in and embody the very Soviet victory. And finally, the history section of Dom Knigy, or the House of Books, in central Moscow had a special bookshelf on Stalin, a whole section, next to the Soviet victory section. Books that had just come out, just published, edited volumes, coffee table books, reissues, all of it, hard to miss. And kitsch too, World War kitsch, Stalin kitsch by the register that glorified the war as you checked out. And that was 2019. What of today, a year or so later? Well, As you can imagine, I was not in Moscow this year. I was right here where I am now. So I know what I know from reading and reports of the festivities. This year, President Vladimir Putin marked Victory Day by calling for unity and honoring those killed during the war, even as the coronavirus pandemic curtailed the usual pomp and circumstance that the Kremlin had planned. With this year, of course, marking 75 years since the Nazi defeat, the Kremlin had hoped to turn already elaborate May 9th celebrations into a platform for Putin to host world leaders and promote what he sees as Russia's rightful place on the world stage. But the coronavirus upended political life, society in general, with millions under lockdown orders, the economy contracting. Putin was forced to limit the celebrations. But at the speech that marked his first public appearance in nearly a month, Putin did not mention the virus or its spread in Russia, focusing solely on the memory of the millions of Soviet citizens who died in what is known as the Great Patriotic War. The themes were victory, martyrdom, and national pride. And just a Putin quote or two here, and then I'll end. We will, as usual, he said, widely and solemnly mark the anniversary date. Do it with dignity, as our duty to those who have suffered, achieved, and accomplished the victory tells us, he said. There will be our main parade on Red Square and the National March of the Immortal Regimen, the march of our grateful memory and inextricable, vital, living communication between and among generations. He also vowed that Russia would always remember the victims of the conflict, which killed an estimated 25 million Soviet citizens, most of them civilians. We know and firmly believe, he said, that we are invincible when we stand together. So there you have it. So final thoughts about what all this means. A couple thoughts. Firstly, most obviously, World War II and its memory undergirds Russian national pride, its sense of military strength. It works to remind the world that Russia, today, 75 years later, is still the power it once was, that it can summon all of its strength and might it needs to champion good over evil with grit and determination. Secondly, it also highlights the commitment and strength and willingness to serve as martyrs all of the Russian citizenry. The 25 million dead, mostly civilians, is always invoked. The martyrdom discourse includes this emphasis on ordinary folks fighting in the street, surviving at any cost, most notably during the siege of Leningrad, of course, where you had populations holed up and starving, still fighting and surviving for 872 days. Thirdly, the emphasis on wartime participation and heroism, still alive in the everyday today in Russia, also does, I would argue, reflect a kind of respect for the older generation, even as it's dying off or has died off, and their service, so often forgotten in the US context. And two, it is worth mentioning how the respect for veterans has, though, diminished as capitalism and the West have penetrated Russian national culture and forms of everyday life. Finally, and this is the point I hope we can collectively discuss in particular, the memory of the war, its commemoration every year, echoes a kind of second Cold War discourse, reinforced by all of the themes I mentioned above. Is it still Russia as world power, history of might and martyrdom, enemy of the US, and so on? I leave you with that and modernity. Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you. And covering the Soviet Union makes a good transition, since the Soviet Union was a power across Europe and Asia to move toward Asia, and our resident Asia expert, Professor Tom Breslin. Tom.
Thanks, David, and thanks to my colleagues for some very insightful presentations, the beginning of a broader discussion, I'm sure. I want to start World War II back in July of 1937, when the Japanese armed forces came below the Great Wall and invaded the heartland of China. That war had many consequences, some of which are still with us today in a very great way, and particularly in the People's Republic of China. The onslaught of the Japanese lasted into 1945, and over that 8 years of fighting, between 80 and 100 million Chinese were displaced from their homes and made refugees, internal refugees. 20 million Chinese died. But another thing that happened was that the national government was unable to continue its suppression of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party survived and came out of the war pretty much untouched, while the nationalists absorbed the brunt and eventually lost a post-World War II civil war as a result of that. They went to hole up in Taiwan, which has evolved into a democracy, something that the mainland government in Beijing, led by the Communist Party under the title of the People's Republic of China, definitely has not become. So the tension between Taiwan and the continent is still tremendous. Also, whenever Chinese nationalists want to create a storm, they bring up the memory of the Japanese invasion, the Second Sino-Japanese War. And that's very, very much an important factor in propagandizing and mobilizing the Chinese people to this day. Another thing about the war was that going into it, the United States and Britain, as well as Japan in its own way, decided to fight a different kind of war. Rather than starving the enemy, they decided to destroy urban centers and destroy the population, and it's the base of military power. So urban bombing, carpet bombing, the development of new weapons like napalm, and of course nuclear weapons became a key element in Allied and Japanese strategy. Not that the Japanese got very far with their atomic program. And this basically led to the post-war period where nuclear strategy and the development of stronger and stronger nuclear weapons became a hallmark of international affairs and the subject of a tremendous amount of strategizing by armchair generals as well as the real generals. We have that today still. Putin's Russia, Obama's and Trump's America have all decided to develop a new generation of nuclear weapons, more useful, it's hoped, than the previous generation, which proved pretty unusable. At least we were lucky that it wasn't used. So that's a heritage, a legacy of World War II. Also going into the war, the United States did not want to have happen to it after the war what happened during the war. And that is to say, a large, very large group of veterans who were very discontented with their post-war circumstances. And so we had the Veterans Administration vastly expanded. We had special housing for the returning soldiers, financing of housing. And above all, we in academia have to be sensitive to the explosive character, the results of the GI Bill. And the GI Bill was very, very important, not only for keeping combat veterans pacified and busy, right? But also providing the now global US empire with the technical, scientific, and professional managers that it didn't have after World War I to replace the British Empire with. And now it could replace the British Empire. And many historians, including myself, feel that replacing the British Empire was a very key goal of the Franklin Roosevelt administration going into the war. Another aspect of the legacy is the end of the colonial empire, starting in Asia and then moving over into Africa. In many post-war periods, the scene is awash with weaponry, and people who were intent on throwing over the colonial masters could easily get their hands on weaponry. And in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Indochina, and in the Philippines, where 1.1 million American nationals had died during World War II as a result of the invasion and then the counter-invasion by the United States. We had the Hukbalahap and other agrarian rebels who eventually were put down with the help of the US government. It was easier to get rid of the foreigners because they were less interested. During the war, synthetic rubber, synthetic silk, and other workarounds that had made the colonial possessions valuable became available. And so there was less incentive to hold on to the colonies, quite apart from the fact that they were resisting with arms. So that end of colonialism, and beginning in Asia and passing over into Africa, was a key legacy of the war. And another one basically were divisions, not just between Taiwan and mainland China, but Korea, North and South divided. The Kuril Islands, still a bone of contention between Russia and Japan. The Senkaku Islands, which passed to Japan, back to Japan, but which China and Taiwan basically agree on that they own. And finally, from a systematic point of view, it's already been mentioned earlier, in the planning for the post-war period, the United States government, especially under Roosevelt, but also as a follow-up with less fervor under Truman, wanted to have a global economic system that really worked, that was not torn apart by regional economic blocks. And so a major effort was made at Geneva in 1947 to basically lay the foundation for what's become the World Trade Organization and globalization. Prior to that, we had the UN founded at San Francisco to be, it was hoped, a mechanism for peace and reconciliation, and particularly for intercultural education. And finally, but not least, at Bretton Woods in 1944, the Allied nations came together to try and figure out, okay, how can we get a firm basis on the post-war economy? And the dollar became the dominant currency at that particular point. The British pound was pushed aside. Britain had basically bankrupted itself by the war. So we had a global system that was very, very much more robust, it proved, than the British system, at least the British system as we know it after World War I. That was just too tottery. So far, so good. Formally, the war ended for most, but not all, the participants in 1951 at San Francisco, with a treaty there involving the United States and 38 nations. But formally, Japan did not make its peace with India until the late 1950s, and the same was true with Indonesia. So there was still a lot of tying up of loose threads, even against the background of war in Indochina. So the legacy was a martial one, but it was also an economic one, a cultural one, an organizational one. And a lot of it was shaped by the experience of World War I and its aftermath.
Great, Tom, thanks so much. So what I'd like to do now is I'll ask a few questions to our panel and encourage you to send your questions in on the Q&A function. John Clark has already sent one in, and I will get to that. John, thank you for that. Or let me start with you. One of the expressions that emerged from World War II was never again. And yet, sadly, time and again, we have seen, not on the same scale as the Holocaust, but cases of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and others. What didn't we learn from what happened in World War II, where we made sure that never again actually meant something?
Thanks, David. That's a really great question. And I'm going to invite any of my other colleagues to chime in also. But look, I think one of the main things we didn't learn comes from both sides. I mean, I think the never again has as I often tell my students, it has a sort of more limited and parochial definition and a broader universal definition. And I think depending on how you understand the phrase, it affects how people understand the past and how they understand their role in the present. So in a more limited way, for example, Jews saying never again should this happen to Jews, let's say, looks at World War II and specifically the Holocaust as a specific set of circumstances largely defined by ongoing underlying anti-Semitism. If anti-Semitism continues to exist, then something like the Holocaust could therefore happen again, and therefore there need to be very specific focused efforts against that. But as a result, it also it's a perspective on on the war and on the Holocaust in particular that sees that genocide, that attempted genocide, as completely different from all others existing, past, present, future. And it really kind of brackets them out, I think, to everyone's, not to anyone's benefit. So I think one of the main things we learned from that is that in that more parochial specific view, it unfairly limits one's purview and ability to understand that genocide is not limited to a particular set of circumstances and a particular set of methods and technologies. So we look at Rwanda, for example, right? And the huge questions like how could some 800,000 or more Rwandans be murdered without the assembly line modern technological means of the Holocaust, right? So that invites a different kind of perspective on never again, which I think is the more universal perspective that understands that, never again should this happen to anyone. And then the question, what haven't we learned? I think what we haven't learned is that hate continues, divisiveness continues. People continue to hate to the degree tribalism and nationalism continues to persist to such a degree that genocide continues to be possible. I think it's the second interpretation that ultimately leads to a more hopeful resolution that says that we can understand, we can learn from the past if we understand that all genocides are unique, but at the same time they all have some common characteristics, and we can learn from one another in order to try to stop it in the future.
Great, thank you, Oren. Terry, let me ask you a question maybe specific to Germany, if I can. The rise of the AfD party is in part a reflection of a sense of certain parts of the German population. We're tired of being held accountable for what we didn't do, but what our previous generations did. How important is it for Germany to come to grips with this past, which it has done to a considerable degree? How much of a threat is something like the AfD to the history of Germany in the 1930s and 40s?
Well, I don't think Germany, I think memorial culture in Germany is multiple, right? And that's part of the reason why you have the attraction of AfD. What's always really interesting to me to look at is to look at the voting maps for the AfD and then the old maps of divided Germany. And you have a lot of folks in Eastern Germany, in former Eastern Germany, who vote AfD. And part of the reason for that is the very different memorial cultures, right? This sort of confessional memorial culture that emphasizes ongoing cultural guilt really comes out of the West, and it's very different than the way of remembering the Second World War that comes out of the East, which is tied more into what Rebecca talked about, right? This commemoration of sort of sacrifice, and it has to do more, and with, remembering the sacrifice of the German nation. That's not to say that the Holocaust was ignored, but it wasn't made as explicit a part of the memory of the Second World War for decades after, as it was in the West. Not that there it was a big part of the memory either. But I would say that in Germany, this memorial culture is very different than the sort of memorial culture in the US, in that, we talk about sort of taking down statues or getting rid of, public, sites of public memory here, and how that'll, affect the way we remember things. In Germany, the sort of public memory is much more robust in a way, right? Because it's baked into the education system. I don't think the rise of the AfD is, of course, very concerning. I don't think it's a threat to distorting that history in the same way, in part because the public historical culture is so much more robust.
Thank you very much, Terry. Rebecca, let me turn to you. And Putin has tried to exploit the memory of World War II. You were touching on this. In some respects, trying to blame Poland in an essay that he wrote earlier this year for the start of World War II and for the Western Allies for selling out the Soviet Union. He also tries to appropriate it to highlight Russia's losses, when in fact, in percentage terms, Belarusians, Ukrainians suffered greater losses than Russians did. How is Putin exploiting the history, the legacy of World War II to his advantage?
I mean, I would simply answer that by suggesting some of the things I know I've already said, which I think that World War II has always worked, and one could argue it's, excuse me, gotten more intense, but it's part of a long trajectory since the war of Russian Soviet leaders exploiting the war on all of these levels, the military, but also the martyrdom and so forth, as a means to project this image of a strong people, not just a strong leader, but a strong people most significantly, which is why it matters that you have the parades, why you have people wearing the hats, why there's a kind of embodiment of the war every year, right? And in some ways, it doesn't matter that the losses were greater elsewhere, that somehow the national narrative, all of the intense discourses around it, in some ways, I don't know, as effectively over time, but at certain moments, certainly in I would argue, post-Soviet history, did have an impact. One of the things, if I can just suggest, made me think something that Terry just said about the divided Germany. I wonder, and there's just a thought I had while you were talking, Terry, is if in former Eastern Germany, part of the reason there is a kind of different coming to terms with guilt, has to do with the ways in which, and it's, of course, this is generational, but people of a certain generation want to distance themselves from the communist past, from the state, from all of it. And so, in a way, I'm not guilty for anything that happened during the war. That wasn't me. I wasn't represented in some way. I don't know. It's just a thought, like the ways in which histories are remembered backwards. It's a thought.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Tom, let me ask you about sort of the post-war period. The United States had the Marshall Plan. The Truman Doctrine was not just for Europe, but there was real focus on Europe. And part of Europe, of course, was under the Soviet Iron Curtain. But for the next 7+ decades, there was no real major conflict on the European continent. When you look at Asia, the United States wound up in 2 wars, in Korea and in Vietnam. How was it that we handled Europe, and what did we do wrong when it came to Asia in the post-World War II aftermath?
Well, I don't know about what we did right or what we did wrong. I mean, that's a problem. Let me go back, if I can, before launching into an answer to that, or trying it to give you an answer to that. How wars are remembered, as both Terry and Rebecca pointed out, is very, very important. The United States eradicated pretty much the anti-war sentiment that existed up to Pearl Harbor, right? There was intense anti-war sentiment. It was only Pearl Harbor, basically, that overcame that. And the second thing is, the United States doesn't talk about the desertion rate in World War II. Its military had a desertion rate higher than during the Vietnam War. And third, there was a mutiny. The United States wanted to have 2.5 million people kept in arms from late 1945 on. And literally, US troops in Europe and in Asia basically said, hell no, you have to send us home. We had open mutiny among the US military in both theaters. Right, and so the Truman administration had to draw down its plans to about 1.5 million, and it was fairly frustrated in what Truman said was to be the U.S. role of being a world policeman, and the citizen soldiers said, "No way are we going to do that." So we had enough of a presence, and I think enough friends or would-be friends in Europe, and we were able to work on a scale within our means to provide for reconstruction, self-interested as it was. it was also useful that we could be focused by opposition to the Soviet Union in Europe. There was no such focus in Asia. There were all these anti-colonial uprisings, and there was a tremendous dissension among Americans about whether to support colonialism or not. There was a strong anti-colonial sentiment. Franklin Roosevelt had embodied it. Truman did not. Truman provided the French with the shipping needed to bring French troops back into Indochina. So that there was a division about Asia in the American political structure that there was not so much in Europe. And there was a much larger theater. I mean, you had Indonesia, Malaysia, India. I mean, and China itself was taken up totally by a civil war, which was spilled way beyond the means of the United States. So scale is really important. Europe was a much smaller scale than all of Asia, and all of Asia was in armed turmoil. There was no way, with mutinous troops demanding to be sent home, that the United States was going to be able to basically replace the European colonial. It tried in Indochina eventually with the French, and look at what happened. So the generation that didn't try to do in Asia what it did in Europe was actually smart, the leadership. When it went to another set of considerations, then it failed.
Great, thanks, Tom. So in our remaining 15 minutes or so, I'm going to turn to questions that we're getting from our viewers. As I mentioned, John Clark sent one in, and anyone who wants to jump at this, isn't U.S. participation in World War II absolutely central to U.S. national identity? Aren't we above all, quote, the country that defeated Nazi fascism and Japanese imperialism? If we weren't, we'd have to be some other country, the country that has failed to live up to its founding ideals after 250 years, the country essentially defeated by Vietnam, et cetera. Anyone want to respond to that? Tom, go ahead.
The founders basically said, don't get involved in chronic tensions between foreign nations. So
Painful in the alliance, yeah, right.
And so basically, no, the United States got late into World War I. It got late into World War II. It basically was very opportunistic. It was in pursuing whatever strategy it might have had at the time. So I think there was a quasi-romantic military vision, memory of US participation in those wars. The Anglo-American tradition in war, well, the American tradition in war is let the others do the bleeding, right? We'll come in only when it's absolutely essential to pursue our ends. If the Nazis and the communists want to kill each other off, fine. If there's a lot of collateral damage, well, that's too bad. But we're not going to get involved. So we stay until Pearl Harbor. We basically hung back as a country. We weren't getting involved. And so it's not a betrayal of the founders' ideals, right, to hang back. It would be to jump in.
Can I just jump? I'd love to jump in because I'd like to take John's question and add it to something that Tom said about American isolationism and something Terry said earlier about kind of the importance of World War II to American memory and identity, especially. And I think John's question really gets to the heart of this kind of dual role that the war can play. It's this play off between the isolation and the engagement. It's this play off between the hang back and let others do the bleeding and jump in and save the world. And I find it just so ironic that 75 years later, politically, even in political slogans, we ended up coming back as a country to the America First isolation idea, right in the 40s. 75 years of this sort of global leadership of the American century, as it were, and now we're embracing that other side again. I think of the isolationism, which ultimately is going to, will have real repercussions in terms of that other dichotomy, that desire to, if we want to make the world a better place, and if we want to try to lead in the world, that's at odds with that role. So I think John's question really points to the heart of, which country are we, right? Which narrative, which memory, which identity do we really want to play out?
But can I speak to that and say the United States has never been isolationist. The United States has always wanted to sell as much as it could, whether it was wheat or guns or whatever, to anybody who would buy it. It was always seeking that sort of an open position, claiming neutral rights or whatever. So I don't think it was ever isolated. I think it was always about making money, moving the country ahead on its own terms. And European and other nations said, no way, right? Or sometimes they set their own terms and the US got involved.
And this is particularly, I think, where memory can be really complicated, right? Because even though the United States exited World War II as a sort of a global hegemon, right? With unparalleled power, Tom mentioned technological power for weapons, but logistics was really at the heart of American power. And even at the moment as the US emerged as this new sort of global power, that myth of being the reluctant savior really allowed the US to deploy its power and at the same time disavow the extent to which it was shaping global politics, right? So a lot of historians and political scientists have argued that the US after World War II is a new form of empire, right? It replaces European direct rule conventional empires with this sort of economic empire. And what really allows America to sort of maintain that image as, a reluctant intervener, a sort of isolationist, like we only pop in benevolently when we're needed, is that memory of sort of the US's role in the Second World War.
Thanks. So we got a few more questions here and we have less than 10 minutes. So keep that in mind. I don't know if anyone has an answer about the impact of Isabel Wilkerson's book, Cast: The Origins of Our Discontent. So unless anyone wants to jump in, sorry, Tamara, for that. Talia asks, at the end of World War II, the United States found itself in a unique position as hegemon with this gets a little bit of what we just covered, as a hegemon with an unspoken responsibility to promote democratization globally. However, in recent years, we have observed a steady decline in democratization. How do you suggest we prevent the proliferation of threats against democratic norms by powers like Russia and China? This is a small question.
Well, we certainly supported enough dictators and military governments in the post-war period to at least put a big question mark under whether or not the United States was pursuing democratization around the world. I lived in a garrison state on Taiwan, and it certainly was no democracy in the 1970s when I was there. And people probably have other or similar memories of other places around the world which were firmly in line with the US.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh, sorry. I might also suggest that the US is not much in a position now to be teaching anyone about democratization.
Anyone else? All right, let me move on. Question about commemoration and memorial culture. The question is, as time creates a distance between generations, how has commemoration memorial culture waned, and how are institutions, including the state, responding to this issue? Good questions, everybody. You've stumped the panel.
Well, one thing I always find when I teach World War II to my students is that it hasn't waned, it's just changed form, right? So students I mean, one of the things that young people really engage with is television and the internet, right? And so I can, talk about commemoration of World War II or public memory all I want, showing pictures of President Trump laying wreaths at the World War II memorial, and students have no idea what's going on, right? But the moment you talk about like History Channel or popular YouTube videos, or even video games, right? Video games set in World War II that narrate major events in the war in a sort of interactive way. These are also parts of the memorial culture, right? And so we think about sort of like those old, parades with lots of tanks. They do that in France in addition to, Russia and other places. That doesn't draw younger generations, but they have their own sort of form of memorial culture where World War II really gets foregrounded.
I think also if you walk into a Barnes and Noble or a chain bookstore, you'll find that books memorializing this battle or that battle of World War II are far more numerous than books on most other subjects. Military historians claim that they don't have enough job opportunities, but they're certainly selling an awful lot of books compared to most of the rest of us working on non-military affairs. So memorializing is going on, sometimes under a hard or a soft cover book.
I would suggest, I would just echo some of what Terry said about kind of youth culture and the importance of the war, which, as you said, is seen in all kinds of video games and this and that these days for young people, but also the ways in which, and in film, the ways in which that kind of allows the holding of this notion of a second Cold War, which is what I was trying to end with. So in some ways, in that culture, the enemy is the same, which is to say, not during the war, since we were allies, of course, but after the war and the Cold War, and the ways in which the war itself is in some ways filtered through this kind of second Cold War culture, which is echoed in video games and such. But I also wanted to suggest that in the Soviet or now the Russian context, I should say, Russian context these days, there still is like a whole channel where you can watch World War II movies all the time. I mean, that basically the kind of importance of the war as this kind of nostalgic moment, despite generations. Maybe the only people who watch it are old, but I bet there are some kids watching with their parents or grandparents. So I bet, to answer the question that Maite asked about generations, I bet that there's a way in which it's perpetuated kind of through this kind of nostalgic memory culture that gets passed down.
Yeah, I want to add also just that, I agree with my colleagues. It's not so much waning as continuing in the same and also different forms. Two things. One is just, I wonder if there is a difference between how nostalgia is in the so-called East and nostalgia in the so-called West, because it strikes me that in Eastern Europe especially, there is more of this grounding in this kind of nostalgia culture, whether the people there lived through it or not. Whereas in the West, it's more of a forgetful kind of culture in many ways, and less interest in that commemoration. But the other thing I just wanted to throw out there is this, the 75-year timetable and what we're seeing, which is happening with a lot of, Holocaust survivors, military liberators and others, is that they're dying. I mean, they're passing from the stage of history. And so we're experiencing right now this real transition from lived history to cultural memory. And so we are seeing shifts because there aren't really that many people around anymore who actually remember. And so we have to rely on those cultural forms and techniques. There aren't many others really to supply that kind of content for us.
I have to apologize to Paul Vincent, Molly Call, and Tamara Freeman that we're not going to have time to get to their 3 questions. So hopefully we can have some follow-up directly with our panelists. But let me bring today's panel to a close and say a huge thanks to Tom Breslin, Rebecca Friedman, Oren Steer, and Terry Peterson for a terrific discussion, very thoughtful remarks and answers to the questions. Really do appreciate you taking the time to do this on this very important issue. The legacy of World War II is seen today. And today's session has been brought to you by the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series at FIU's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. I'm David Kramer in Miami, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.